Hello, everybody. Today is October 8th, and this is the OLM Dev Working Group meeting. Thank you for attending. On today's agenda, we're going to talk about the simplification of a building and operator, aka the CSV list bundles, and collect some feedback from the community. This is going to be led by Dan Solver. We have a comment by Pam who wants to discuss some of the security concerns around OLM's cluster role and the significant cluster privileges that go along with it. We're going to do a quick dive into some of the OLM webhook integration and how certs are managed without the cert manager operator. And Jay wants to discuss a failing E2E test. So I'm going to hand the meeting over to Dan if he's here.
Yes, thanks, Alex. So what I wanted to bring to the community today was some background around a feature that we were working on, actually attempting to deliver back 6 months ago. And we ran into some significant challenges around the user experience. And the feature is, as Alex described, a simplified bundle format. We've introduced this new bundle, image-based bundle format that goes into this image-based index, but a requirement to build a valid bundle is to have the CSV object present in the bundle, exactly one CSV. And so what we tried to do is to simplify building bundles by trying to break up the CSV object and make it so that you can build a valid bundle without a CSV. So if you look into the agenda, I provided a link to the enhancement that sort of outlines our latest take on how to go about building a bundle without a CSV. Now, those of you who have familiar with bundles and OLM, which I imagine most of you are, know that the CSV contains a lot of information that's both runtime information that you need to run a deployment on Kubernetes, like the deployment spec that's embedded in the CSV. So it has some important runtime information, but also has metadata in it related to the operator itself, like its icon or its categories or its maintainers. So it has a whole bunch of information in it. And some of that information is to install another cluster, and some of that information is to drive the UI. So I guess what I wanted to hear first was from members of the community who have built CSVs and have built bundles. If they want to share their experience, is it complicated and convoluted, or not? And we can go into some of the ideas that we have around making this process better. But I'd love to hear from anyone on their experience with CSVs and bundles.
So one of the things that I definitely noticed with CSVs and bundles, one of the things that a lot of the teams that I work with have been confused about is the kind of half generated, half kind of manually modified nature of them. I know that the operator SDK will generate a bunch of it, but then you can go in and you can edit some of it yourself, and then the operator SDK is supposed to leave that alone, but then sometimes that process doesn't quite flow well. I think that if we can go for CSV lists and we can move all of the Kubernetes manifests into their own files and that kind of thing, I think that will help people understand what they're supposed to be editing and what they're not supposed to be editing, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Could you maybe could you speak maybe into a little bit more detail around what the SDK does and doesn't generate?
So I know that some of the teams have had trouble with related images because they're supposed to put those in, but then sometimes when you run the operator SDK generate, they disappear. There's other stuff that's kind of like the description and things like that, which you wouldn't expect here to generate from anywhere because it's kind of metadata about the operator that's really for the UI. that you have to put in manually. Yeah, that kind of thing, really. A lot of the CSV is just generated from Kubernetes manifests. I mean, so yeah.
This is Chris. So to me, it totally makes sense to me to separate out the concerns where they should be instead of a big monolithic file. The related images is a key one because that thing is gonna be huge, right? And so we're gonna blow the size of a CSV in no time, right? So I think having all of those things in manifests where they belong makes total sense to me.
I second that. This is Joe. Another thing that kind of an observation here is, like permissions and things that are in the CSV. So, it's kind of like almost exactly like the YAML file, but it isn't. And I'm not aware of ways to if we really wanted labels and things on the roles and role bindings or cluster roles and whatnot, I'm not sure how to do that because those resources are generated when you process the CSV. So splitting them out and letting us, kind of just package those up in the manifest directory sounds like a good idea. And another case would be if you had prereqs, right? If you had some YAML files that you just wanted to get deployed, if you could put those in there, I think that simplifies some things.
Yeah, that fits well with another use case actually for me, where we're getting hit by customers who are saying, well, you've got this cluster permission for your operator, what do you need it for? We're looking for a way to document that. If we could put labels and things on the roles, then that might help us kind of either point to documentation or kind of put a little description in there saying this is used so that the operator can, stuff like that. Although that's probably a bit of a misuse of labels and annotations. It's kind of just one option we've been floating for how to describe that kind of thing to customers in the right place.
Right. Yeah. So these are all really, really helpful points to hear to get this feedback. So clearly, there is some things that the CSV is aggregating that are kube objects like deployments and these roles and cluster roles, and it seems like there's interest in keeping those around, but having them be separate from some of the other metadata. So basically, when we started developing this feature a while back, we ran into the problem of basically trying to preserve all of the extensive information that the CSV now has, but by putting it into like a separate file, like a bundle.yaml file that has all this other metadata. And then basically what ends up happening is you end up with a separate file that has a lot of complexity in it, and it's not necessarily the CSV object but it's a different YAML file that is also hard to work with. So one of the things I want to talk about is that there's lots of ways to package and deploy content onto a Kubernetes cluster. Is there interest in, let's say take Helm bundles, Helm charts, and take our bundles? Is there interest in having like a simplified type of object that OLM can manage that is like a stripped down version of a CSV or something? Like, is there any interest in something like that?
Go ahead, James.
Sorry, I lost the mute button. I'm not sure how much of the CSV we wouldn't need. I mean, you talk about a simplified version. I think everything in the CSV, isn't that all stuff that we need at the moment?
But I think Chris kind of mentioned like separation of concerns. I mean, if there's some things that drive a UI experience, does it make sense should they be their own resource type or whatnot? I think there's ways to segment those out. And I agree, James, you would need all those. I think you need all that stuff, but it's a question of, is there another resource type that would represent an operator or something like that?
I don't know if this is super directly relevant to getting feedback, but this is Joe from the SDK team. The SDK CSV generation in 1.x has improved a lot in this regard, and it kind of goes along with what you guys are saying in terms of separation of concerns. So I don't think, like, obviously the end output of the SDK CSV generation is still kind of the big monolithic CSV, but the input now is a little bit different, where we use customize. So there's a customized base that basically contains the metadata. And then the way that SDK works now is we basically pipe all of the other Kubernetes manifests into a generation command that knows how to populate the rest of the CSV. So you kind of get the separation now where you manually have your own base file that has all of the non-Kubernetes manifest related things. And then you have a separate set of manifests that get kind of added into the CSV by SDK, such that the output is the full CSV with everything in it, but you don't necessarily have to, at that point, kind of the assumption that SDK is making and helping others make is that, like, the CSV generation is idempotent. So you no longer have to muck with the final generated CSV file. You're kind of changing your underlying customized manifests or your CSV base. So I think what I would be interested in from the SDK standpoint is, like, are there any gaps in that? And I heard a couple potentially. So, like, the related images, is that something that can be input into the CSV base manually, such that it always kind of stays and propagates into the final CSV that gets generated? Another option potentially could be CSV markers. Are there any markers that would be nice to add to Go code that would make their way into the CSV file, or as Dan's talking about here, like, into this new CSV list bundle format? So I don't want to derail the conversation too much, but I think SDK is kind of also very interested in the way this goes, because there's going to be an impact on how SDK generates bundles going forward with this as well.
Would it not be interesting to think of, running customize in the kube builder project and just pipe those YAML files directly into the operator bundle directory without going through a lot of that conversion?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, that would be totally, I think there's a couple of hurdles potentially to overcome. And I'm sure the OLM team can probably talk more about this, but right now, like, the set of resources that are allowed in a bundle is a subset of all resources. So there's still, like, some processing that potentially has to happen. But yeah, I think, Dan, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that's kind of the direction, right?
Yes. We're alongside this simplification of the CSV in the bundle is the idea of allowing arbitrary kube objects to be placed in the bundle. Right now, as Joe pointed out, there are some explicit objects that we allow, and then there's a whole universe of objects that we don't allow in the bundle. That list of objects has grown recently to include not only things like secrets and config maps, but also pod disruption budgets and priority classes and vertical pod autoscaler objects. But there is also this desire to not only not have a CSV in your bundle, but also allow you to place any arbitrary Kubernetes manifest into the bundle and have OLM installed for the cluster onto the cluster for you. But in order for that, in order to have arbitrary kube objects in your bundle, you sort of need CSV. You sort of want CSV-less bundles so that the experience is better, and so you don't end up in a situation where you have a CSV in a bundle and a deployment in the bundle, and which one is the operator. So that's just another thing that we are also working on recently, that we kind of ran into. I guess we ran into some UX issues there as well, but that's also something else that I can bring up for the community, is something that we're also trying to work on as well. So yeah, so this has been a great discussion. I don't have anything else on my end. I think we can, unless anybody has anything, we can move on to the next topic on the agenda. Alex.
It's a little. I've got something that's a little bit kind of adjacent. In terms of the permission thing, another thing that we have been looking at recently, and again, like I was saying, with customers who are complaining about how many cluster permissions we have and what we need them for. One of the other benefits that this could provide is being able to kind of mark parts of our permissions as optional. So we could say, oh, well, if you have this permission and the operator knows it's got it, then it will be able to manage this for you. Otherwise, you'll have to do that bit yourself, right? And that would, so kind of thinking about like the Android ecosystem, where you can install an app and say, well, yeah, give it this permission, but don't give it this permission. It's not exactly part of CSV-less bundles, but it's just something that was in my head that would be kind of helped by the move.
Great. Well, I captured all that in the meeting notes, and if anybody shared any information, if you could just go back and just make sure I captured your comments effectively, that'd be great. There were a lot of them. Moving on, Pam wanted to discuss some of the security concerns regarding OLM cluster roll. Pam, do you want to kick that off?
Yeah, hi. So yeah, I just wanted to pop in and ask a little bit about the OLM cluster roll, simply because there's a lot of security concern within my team about that cluster roll, just because all of the resources and verbs are basically allowed right now, and I'm not really sure if this is on the horizon for anybody looking at this, if this can be kind of narrowed down to what's actually needed. I know that's easier said than done. Yeah, just wondering if anyone had any thoughts as to how we could maybe seal this up a little bit.
Yeah, great question. So just to give a little background nature on why OLM requires so many permissions is because OLM basically has to have the authority to provide any operator it installs with the permissions that it needs and defines in the CSV under the permissions and cluster permissions settings. However, there is a way to, I'll link it under the topic, limiting, where you can limit operator. When an OLM installs an operator into a namespace, one of the requirements is that you provide an operator group, and in that operator group, you can specify which namespaces to watch. What you can also do is specify a service account that any of the operators running in that operator group should use. And you can use that service account to limit the RBAC permissions of the operators that you install. And that gives you some degree of security, right? Because OLM won't go granting extra permissions to the operators that we install. But currently, as far as I know, there's no way to limit OLM's RBAC permissions simply because the number of RBAC permissions that an operator may or may not request is so great. Does anybody on the other team, or sorry, does anybody else on the OLM team have any comments here? Because I think we have a way to limit the RBAC that we provide users with a way to limit the RBAC that will be available for operators that are installed, but I don't know of any solution for limiting the actual RBAC that the OLM operator has.
This might be a totally off the wall thing, but the Helm project, when they moved from Helm v2 to Helm v3, they kind of had this similar problem where Tiller was this in-cluster component that had all accesses and could do just about everything. And Helm solved it by just totally eliminating that and having the users who are submitting requests to the clusters, they're the ones that have the permissions that are checked for what can be deployed, what can't be deployed. I don't know if that fits at all with the way that OLM works, but it would be an interesting thought exercise to think about, like, can we somehow have some sort of admission webhooks that look at who's creating subscriptions and limit the things that get created based on the user that created the subscription, for example?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think an additional piece of background information on why OLM had these vast permissions from the beginning was that subscriptions were originally planned to be created by cluster admins and not so much users of OLM. Clearly that design has changed in more recent times, and I don't think we've gone back and revisited whether or not we should change the scope of the permissions of OLM.
One of the things about OLM which I was never 100% sure on, and maybe it's changed, and maybe it's just my understanding, but the nature of subscriptions and being able to create them in a way allows people to kind of do privilege escalation, but potentially do privilege escalation in a safe-ish way, where where the cluster administrator is saying these are the operators you can use, and then people in namespaces and stuff can say, okay, well, I want to just install this one operator that has been kind of green lit by my cluster administrator. Is that one of the goals of OLM originally? It sounds like no. And would we ever want it to be a goal? I'm not sure myself.
Yeah, that exact model is why subscriptions work the way they do, and it's also why I think OLM has a weird UX around CSVs, where none of your permissions get created for you, even though it's all there in the CSV. The idea was that it would be reasonable for end users to be creating operators, but if they needed permission for it, they'd have to create it themselves with whatever permissions they had, so that you couldn't ask OLM to create something for you unless you got it from a subscription, which came from a catalog, which is something that your administrator has designed for you to use. So yeah, that is definitely a part. I mean, definitely worth asking if that's a valuable model or not, but that is why it works that way.
Cool. Is that documented anywhere? Because that kind of role split, I don't think I've ever read about.
It was documented. I can go see if that has disappeared or changed or not.
Cool, thank you. A brief question. When you limit an operator group using a service account, if that service account doesn't have the permissions required for creating that operator, does it stop creating the operator, or does it just create it and not provide it the permissions?
I believe the install requirements would not be met, so it would not install the operator. Evan, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, the install plan will fail because OLM won't be able to create things with it.
Perfect, good.
So what we might want to do with this issue is flag it as a topic we want to revisit in the future planning, because although we offer some tooling around limiting the permission of operators that OLM installs, there's no way to actually limit the RBAC that OLM itself has, which seems to be the crux of the issue that Pam was that Pam wanted to address. Is that correct?
I mean, if you were to edit the service account that's running OLM itself, wouldn't that do it? Or would something try and put it back?
Upstream, it would, the service accounts would not be changed.
Someone mentioned this earlier too, which was Android permissions. And I think it's worth revisiting that model for OLM to see if it makes sense to do something where like you approve the first set of permissions and then OLM will attempt to update with that set of permissions, maybe encoded as a service account or something. And then if it requires more permissions, then you have to reapprove the updates.
Yeah, I think that's a good model to apply in so many things in our whole industry. I think it does fit quite well here.
Okay, then I'm going to just create 2 issues, one for the Android style permissions and actually, we don't even need a second issue because there already is one 1685 for the topic we were just discussing. So we'll revisit those in the feature planning meeting on Thursday next week. Does that sound good to everybody?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, Chris, you had some questions regarding the OLM webhook integration. I try to answer in line before the meeting, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions that still.
Yeah, yeah, you did answer them, and I think this is very helpful. I think the biggest thing is the last. We just need. I think the documentation just needs to get updated a little bit to clarify that the kube builder kind of depends on Cert Manager, the JetStack stuff, and OLM has basically abstracted that out, and so you don't have to use that. And so I think it was confusing because I think we had some components that were going to go ahead and start pre-recking Cert JetStack and all this kind of stuff to make it work because of kube builder. So we need to make that. I think we should document, because definitely our customers care about certificates, life cycle, who has access to them, where they're stored, and all that kind of stuff. And so I think it'd be good to know or to describe exactly how this works.
Okay, I'll add a to-do to add that under certificate authority requirements, and yeah, that should be good enough. And then maybe I can also propagate the, outsourcing certificate authority to, Cert Manager and Service CA Operator, and we can discuss that more publicly.
I think there's an open OLM issue for this too, right? Not just for documentation, but for like improving the UX behind managing certificates.
Yeah, I think so the issue that jumps to mind is, right, so OLM managed API services prior to managing any webhooks in general. And when we implemented webhooks, we basically built the cert. We basically extended the cert management system that was targeted for API services and extended that to webhooks as well. So the webhook certificates are actually mounted in a different location than what Cert Manager expects them to be managed at right now. The short-term solution to that is, either just also mounting them where Cert Manager expects them, or allowing people to configure where they manage them. But I don't think it encompasses the entire outsourcing of cert management from OLM to one of these third-party Cert Manager providers, right? Unless there's a second one you're talking about.
Well, no, I was just wondering if there's a GitHub issue that tracks this.
I do not believe there is a GitHub issue that tracks integration with Cert Manager and the Service CA Operator.
Okay. Do you think we should create one to just track this discussion?
Yeah, it's probably worth doing, since I think this is going to be a feature people ask for more and more.
Okay.
Yeah, just in our own workloads, we've basically elevated certificate and key rotation, all that kind of stuff, all the way up to the top to make sure people are not doing self-signed anything, right? Or if they are, make it very clear that they are, and then give customers a way to bind in their own. So that would be great if we could, document this and then also provide a plug point in the future.
Okay, I had an action item, so I can follow up and do that. I'm not going to do that right now since we're leading the meeting. But is there anything else we want to discuss here, or should that take care of everything we need to discuss?
I think that's all I needed. I think Joe, you and I were talking about this offline. I don't think there's anything else, right?
Well, I guess the one I'm just looking for clarification on the rotation of those certs. Does that happen?
Yes.
In
So
this
right
model?
now, yes. So right now, OLM will create the cert, and it will have a timestamp for 2 years from the point where the cert was created, at which point OLM will rotate the cert, and it expires at that point as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okie dokie.
Grant,
Jay?
oh,
Oh.
sorry. I just wanted to learn more about the cases where we care how the certs are generated. I understand that like there are probably clusters with compliance issues that require all certs to be, tied back to some, org cert or something like that. But I was curious what actual manager and service CA operator.
Yeah, so I think a lot of it is customers are demanding bring your own cert, bring your own key and bring your own cert. They really like that capability because it gives them isolation, right? Especially when we have multi-tenant clusters and that kind of thing. So we're just seeing that as much, as a theme more and more.
Are we seeing that outside clusters as well as inside clusters? Because from my experience, it's mainly, we want to be able to use our own certs so that our clients can connect rather than just for internal kind of pod to pod communication, which this is, right? This is cluster API server connecting to a webhook.
Yeah, we had some customers back in the old ICP days, right? So where they had, they wanted to split up the cluster into multiple tenants, right? And they wanted to be able to, each customer to be able to bind in their own certs for their own workloads. And using network policies to carve those off wasn't enough. They wanted to having a zero trust methodology within the cluster network. So it's probably not as popular at the moment, but I'm guessing it's going to be popular again.
Can we discuss the use case where a user wants to speak to a webhook instead of just a pod-to-pod communication? This is a use case that I just don't fully understand yet.
I guess I don't think I said that.
I thought James had mentioned that. Had mentioned that use case.
No, I was saying that when we're talking bring your own cert, what we're normally talking about is services that are exposed outside the cluster, or services that they are directly interfacing with. And I was saying that actually that's unlikely with webhooks.
Oh, I
right.
see.
So
Okay.
yeah. So you're talking about like the ingress controller. Of course, you'd have bring your own cert there because you're going to plug into your corporate, CA and that kind of stuff. In the internal pod or cluster network, you typically don't care, right? Other than you want a CA maybe bound to your namespace or something like that, or bound to your workload instance, which allows you to do, endpoint-based authentication, right? So the zero trust kind of thought. So I think the industry in general is moving more and more towards zero trust, which is basically requiring you to have your own CAs. And then if you're going to have your own CAs, you have to have your own lifecycle management philosophy. And then by centralizing it and separating that out to another service who has a policy-driven approach, now you've simplified it and you only have from a governance perspective.
Yeah, so it kind of makes sense to me as a thing that you might have imposed as a requirement. Like someone's going down like a HIPAA checklist and saying all TLS certs in your cluster are signed with the corporate CA.
Yes.
But I don't really see value from like the technical perspective. Oh, well, and something is generating certs, handing one side to API server, handing the other side to the webhook, and that's it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as we start getting more into more of these very large customers, the kind of twisted thoughts that they have around governance and compliance controls and all this kind of stuff, and how they've divided their corporation. So it's interesting now. You used to have the DBA, but now you got the CERT administrator, you've got the Docker registry administrator. They've carved things up into certain silos, and they've created rules that seem arbitrary, but they make sense to them, right? And so in enterprises, we end up having, unfortunately, you have to have a lot of knobs in order to be able to satisfy all those requirements.
Yeah, that
things
makes
like I was going to say there's also things like, you know, which curve are you choosing, which version of TLS are you choosing? There's all of those things that go into like how is the cert actually generated that people might be caring about.
Yep, which crypto APIs. Yep.
Right.
Yeah, and another point, I don't know if it's exact, I mean, it kind of crosses again between SDK and OLM, but I mean, a code builder based project, you know, uses CA injection and annotation, so it produces different output than as far as the manifest files. So, you know, if you're just deploying locally or whatnot with Kube Builder, there's a difference there, right? The resources that are created. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like when you run make deploy, you're getting cert manager style deployment. When you're building a bundle and then running the bundle via OLM, it's a totally different style, no cert manager involved. So it's hard to debug the differences.
Yeah, and then kind of another use case that we have is, you know, we have a quote, a common service that deploys a specific cert management service that, you know, for consistency, now you have, you know, this cert management system and you have this other one, and you know, an admin guy like the HIPAA guy now has to deal with two different processes and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, and I guess I would also bring up one technical reason to do this is just that the cert rotation that OLM does is super rudimentary compared to some of these dedicated cert rotation services. So like there's no cross signing at all. You will have some downtime as certs are rotated. So I think there's a lot of value in delegating it out for the governance reason, also this technical reason, and also just like there's a lot of things that are dedicated to doing this, and there's no reason that OLM needs to worry about it if there's other things that do it better. So I think those are all.
I assume there's no revocation either.
Replication of what? Sorry.
Revocation.
Revocation. No, there's not.
Nope.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll talk more about this in depth when we revisit it in the future planning meeting and we speak it up there. There is one last thing on the agenda from Jay about E2E test failures.
Yep, sure. Thank you. Actually, I was trying to add a test case to the end-to-end test for a scenario called patching the CSV for hotfixes. So I ran into an issue. Also posted this in the OLM dev channel, right? Like one of the images pulled down by the catalog operator, the config map operator registry image. So it was actually crashing. I think the latest one, which just got pushed like 2 hours back, I think it has some problems, like the image is not running. So I did try to change that image to a previous version. Like there was a v1.14 version that was pushed like 2 weeks back. I did change the template in the charge directory to this 1.14 version of the image instead of latest, and the test seemed to run. I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know who's responsible for pushing that image. So I suspect that would be a problem with the latest image. So I was able to get past that problem, and the test seemed to run. I still have a few test failures, I think, but they were mostly related to some timeouts. So I need to spend some more time to figure out what those timeouts were. So.
Yeah, just for some background for you guys. So we in the past we talked about how do we hotfix things, right? And so one of them was how do we hotfix a catalog, right? And so one of the things we wanted to make sure is that the behavior where a CSV is updated in the resource directly doesn't get re-reconciled with the catalog and blow away our hotfix changes. And so we were going to go ahead and create Jay's creating basically a test case to verify that it doesn't regress that behavior. So now this is kind of our first attempt to try some end-to-end test cases, and so now he's of course running into a few bugs.
Right.
So it looks like the action is to actually just make sure that this EOE image upstream is working in the latest version.
I think so, yeah.
Great. Could, Jay, would you mind creating an issue against OLM just so we can track where this originated and these steps in order to reproduce it?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Do you want that in OLM or do you want that inside the registry, operator registry? Repo?
Evan, where do you think it should go?
I think it should find out on the registry side because it's the config map image.
Yes. Do you guys have an official build process for these things, or do they just get built on someone's Mac and uploaded? How do these things actually get published?
There are Git hooks that trigger the build.
All right, so you've got some kind of like Travis job or something that runs.
Quay is hooked up directly to the repo, and Quay will watch for Git events. And
Got it.
Okay, in that case, I think that's everything we had on the agenda today.
Just had one other quick question. So it looks like next week you're going to continue this bi-monthly or bi-weekly, whatever, cadence on reviewing features. So for next week, I guess there was a bunch of things that I had put on the list kind of that weren't really features per se. I didn't have RFEs created for those things. Do we want to scrub through that list before I create RFEs for all those things, or do we want to kind of, or you just want to talk through some of that information as we go through? I just want to prepare for next week.
I wasn't actually here for the previous meeting, so Kevin, since you led that one, would you mind commenting here?
So, sorry, Chris, just trying to understand context. When you say create RFE, do you mean create an RFE like in the Red Hat internal Jira?
No, no. So in the feature meeting, Alex went ahead and created a bunch of RFE issues inside OLM and the operator registry upstream repos. And so he kind of linked them, all the stuff you've got on milestones to that, and you're using milestone tracking to track those RFEs from the upstream perspective. And so then I went ahead and added a bunch of other stuff that I'm tracking from things that my company is looking for that I don't know if we actually have RFEs for. So I wanted to discuss them at some point. And it seemed like that feature meeting might be more appropriate than this meeting for those kinds of things.
Yeah, so I think that there's probably two different cases. And I think both are probably appropriate. So if you feel like you have a good understanding of exactly what the feature would look like and some high-level implementation details, sort of similar to the RFEs that are already on the issues that we looked at last week, and you feel like you can just sort of articulate that, feel free to create an RFE issue. And then if we can discuss it, and if there are any changes we need to make it on top of that, we can always just comment. So I think that's one. And then for stuff where the implementation, the high-level implementation stuff is less obvious, and how exactly it would work or what exactly would be implemented is not clear, you can always either just come to that meeting with those ideas or maybe a doc or whatever, and then we can, I think as part of the process of that meeting, sort of like jot some of that down and create the RFE.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to end the meeting. Thank you, everybody, for attending today and for sparing all that great conversation.